The night skies over England in early 1944 were never truly dark. Searchlights probed the clouds like ghostly fingers. The distant rumble of bombers heading toward the continent was as familiar as thunder. But on the remote airfields scattered across East Anglia, something different stirred. Aircraft painted black from nose to tail, stripped of their usual insignia, marked only by faint stencils that glimmered under the floodlights. They didn't carry bombs. They carried secrets. At precisely 23:45 hours, the engines of a modified B-24 Liberator roared to life at RAF Harrington. Its name, unofficial and never written down, was the Duchess. Inside, the crew prepared for a mission that technically didn't exist. Their orders were handwritten and burned after reading. Their uniforms bore no patches. If captured, they would not be acknowledged by any government. To the official war records, these men would simply vanish. The pilot, Captain Robert Bobby Andrews of the 801st Bomb Group, glanced over at his navigator. "Same route?" he asked quietly. The navigator nodded, his face lit only by the red glow of the cockpit lamp. "Same route, but London wants us to drop earlier. Resistance says the fields are flooded." Andrews gave a thin smile. "Then we'll make our own weather." Outside, ground crewmen waved flashlights in silent arcs. The B-24 taxied down the damp runway, its black fuselage reflecting the faintest shimmer of moonlight. The four engines reached full power, and within seconds the heavy aircraft lifted into the fog, swallowed by the night. For months, Allied command had been preparing for the greatest invasion in history, Operation Overlord, the assault on Nazi-occupied France. But before the beaches could be stormed, the underground war had to be won. French resistance groups needed weapons, explosives, and, above all, communication. Every radio operator behind enemy lines risked discovery daily. Every agent parachuted into France needed supplies and coordinates to survive. The mission to deliver them had a code name, Operation Carpetbagger. Born in secrecy within the halls of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, Carpetbagger's purpose was simple and deadly: to fly deep into occupied Europe under cover of darkness, drop agents, containers of weapons, and money to resistance fighters, and disappear before dawn. It was the kind of mission that could never be made public. A single captured pilot could unravel an entire network of underground operatives. That's why, as historian Major John T. Keeler would later write, the Carpetbaggers didn't fly for glory, they flew for ghosts. At their bases, Harrington, Alconbury, and Tempsford, mechanics worked around the clock to convert standard bombers into silent couriers. The B-24 Liberators were repainted matte black to absorb moonlight. Gun turrets were removed to make room for supply containers. The bomb bays were retrofitted with plywood racks for parachute canisters, filled not with bombs, but with rifles, grenades, radios, and British pounds in waterproof bags. Crewmen learned to fly at treetop level, navigating by the faint outlines of rivers and railway tracks. They trained to find coded light signals from partisans waiting in the French countryside. 3 flashes for recognition, a single flash for drop zone ready. It was a war waged in whispers. As the Duchess crossed the English Channel, the men inside felt the vibration change. The hum of the engines blended with the constant creak of metal under strain. The radio operator adjusted his headset and caught a faint transmission, a coded message from London: "Windmill spins thrice. Proceed to target Alpha." That meant the resistance team in Normandy was in position. The co-pilot checked his wristwatch. 0:58 hours. "Crossing the coast," he murmured. Andrews nodded. "Lights out." The crew dimmed every bulb in the cockpit. Even their cigarettes were extinguished. Below them stretched a landscape of blackness, broken only by the occasional flash of German flak. The navigator leaned over his chart, tracing a line with a trembling finger. 10 minutes to the drop. In a waste compartment, 2 crewmen hauled a cylindrical container to the edge of the open hatch. It was stenciled rifles, number 4 MKI. Next to it sat a canvas bag containing 2 French agents dressed in civilian clothes, each with a pistol strapped under his coat. They exchanged a silent glance as the wind howled through the fuselage. The red light turned amber. The altimeter read 600 feet. The pilots steadied the aircraft. Then green. One after another, the agents vanished into the night. The containers followed, tumbling toward a patch of farmland, invisible from above. The B-24 banked hard left, throttles wide open, climbing back into the cloud cover. Mission time, 13 minutes. When they returned to England 3 hours later, the ground crew was waiting with thermoses of coffee, but no questions. There were never any debriefs, never any congratulations. Only brief notes written in cipher. Delivery successful. 2 agents inserted. 3 containers dropped. And then it was on to the next night. For the men of the 801 SD/492 Indy Bomb Group, provisional, life was a cycle of exhaustion, secrecy, and silence. Their missions weren't listed on the same roster as the daylight bomber crews. They had no kill counts, no medals, and no newsreel coverage. Yet, every night, their actions shaped the course of the coming invasion. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Carpetbagger aircraft had delivered more than 4,000 tons of supplies, over 500 agents, and millions of francs in counterfeit German currency to resistance groups. They had flown through fog, snow, and tracer fire, and lost dozens of aircraft to flak and navigation errors. But their success couldn't be measured in tonnage. It was measured in whispers, in sabotage missions that crippled German rail lines, and in coded messages that helped guide paratroopers on D-Day. They were called the Ghost Squadron for a reason. They didn't exist on paper. They existed only in the night. The story of Operation Carpetbagger did not begin with glory. It began with desperation. By late 1943, the Allied High Command had realized that bombing campaigns and military planning alone could not liberate Europe. The continent was an occupied fortress, guarded not just by soldiers, but by information, fear, and control. To crack it open, they needed eyes and ears inside, men and women who could fight behind enemy lines. But those resistance cells were starving for weapons, for money, for contact. Without direct support from the air, they would wither long before D-Day. It was in this context that a new, secret unit was born. At first, it had no name. Only a handful of senior officers in the Office of Strategic Services in Washington and the Special Operations Executive in London knew what it would become. The British had been dropping agents into France since 1941, but their aging Whitley and Halifax bombers lacked range, speed, and precision. The Americans had something the British didn't. Hundreds of B-24 Liberators, long-range bombers capable of carrying massive payloads deep into occupied territory. But to turn a daylight bomber into a clandestine courier of spies would require more than paint and luck. It demanded total transformation. The decision came in December 1943. The U.S. 8th Air Force assigned a new provisional group to this purpose, the 801st Bomb Group, provisional, based at RAF Harrington in Northamptonshire. It would later merge with elements of the 492nd to become one of the most secretive flying units of the entire war. On paper, it was simply another bomber training squadron. In reality, it was a ghost organization, its personnel, flight logs, and communications deliberately disguised within the bureaucratic noise of the Air Force. At Harrington, the transformation began. Crews who had flown daylight raids over Germany were told they were being reassigned to special operations. No one explained what that meant. The first thing they noticed was that their aircraft were being repainted completely black. Not dark green, not camouflaged, black from nose to tail. Engineers stripped the bombers of unnecessary armor and gun turrets, replacing them with wooden flooring, parachute racks, and modified chutes for containers. The bomb bays were refitted to hold steel canisters roughly the size of torpedoes, each one filled with weapons, radios, or ammunition. The Liberators that emerged from those hangars were unlike any others in the war. Their profiles were familiar, but their purpose was invisible. Instead of carrying death to the enemy, they carried hope to the occupied. The men soon began calling them blackbirds, though some preferred another term whispered with half-joking reverence: ghost ships. Training was relentless and unlike anything the crews had experienced. Gone were the tight formation drills of daylight bombing runs. Now, they flew alone at night, often just a few hundred feet above the ground. They learned to navigate by moonlight and river reflection, to read the faint outlines of hills and roads through fog. Every crewman practiced identifying coded light signals from the ground: 3 flashes for recognition, 2 flashes for readiness. If the pattern was wrong, they were to abort immediately. Many believed those moments between signal and decision were the longest seconds of their lives. Each mission required perfect coordination between 3 forces: the air crews, the SOE handlers in London, and the resistance teams in France. The smallest error could mean disaster. There were times when a single misplaced comma in a coded message led to aircraft dropping containers into German-held zones. There were nights when pilots circled for hours, desperate to find the correct signal, before finally turning back with their cargo still on board. The consequences of mistakes were unspoken, but everyone knew them. For the men and women waiting on the ground, failure meant capture, torture, or execution. The missions themselves were deceptively simple on paper. A typical route took the Liberators across the Channel into northern France or the Low Countries, sometimes as far as Czechoslovakia. Most flights were under 5 hours. Crews usually consisted of a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radio operator, and 2 dispatchers responsible for pushing the containers out over the target. Some flights also carried agents, men and women trained by the SOE or OSS, who would parachute into darkness carrying false identities, cyanide capsules, and the hope of starting revolts. For the pilots, the psychological strain was immense. Flying at 500 feet in total darkness over occupied Europe was unlike any combat mission. There were no formation lights, no friendly aircraft nearby, and no flares to guide them home. The Liberators' engines echoed through the night like 4 thunderclaps, and every village below could be a nest of German anti-aircraft guns. Many crews described the strange duality of those nights: the absolute silence inside the cockpit, broken only by engine vibration and the occasional creak of the fuselage, and the knowledge that one wrong move could end the entire crew in a heartbeat. Yet there was also something magnetic about those missions, something that separated the Carpetbaggers from the regular bomber wings. Theirs was not a war of destruction, but of connection. They were delivering life, help, tools, and trust to people they would never meet. A few airmen wrote in their diaries about the strange emotion of watching tiny lantern signals appear in the French countryside, knowing that friends of freedom were down there, risking everything for one night's success. The secrecy around Operation Carpetbagger was so complete that even families of the men involved knew nothing. Letters home were censored, flight logs falsified. When crews were lost, telegrams simply reported missing on special duty. It was a silence that weighed heavily. Some pilots joked about it, others prayed, but none could share what they were truly doing. After the war, many would describe the hardest part not as the missions themselves, but the inability to tell anyone why they mattered. As winter turned to spring in 1944, the operation expanded. Bases at Tempsford and Alconbury began contributing flights. The OSS shipped tons of equipment to England: silenced pistols, demolition charges, Sten guns, and radio sets the size of lunchboxes. In less than 6 months, the Carpetbaggers dropped over 3,000 containers and inserted more than 350 agents. Resistance networks flourished. Bridges were blown, railways sabotaged, and communication lines severed. The German occupation began to strain under the invisible weight of thousands of small disruptions. By May 1944, just weeks before D-Day, the results were undeniable. German supply trains were delayed by days, sometimes weeks. Entire convoys disappeared into the night, victims of mines placed by guerrillas who had once been unarmed farmers. Every successful Carpetbagger drop amplified the chaos, forcing the Wehrmacht to divert troops and resources away from the front. And yet, for all their success, the men of the 801st remained ghosts. They had no unit insignia, no mention in newspapers, no public acknowledgement. Their existence was protected by secrecy orders signed by both Churchill and Eisenhower. If one of their aircraft went down, the operation would be denied. Still, they flew. Night after night, they crossed the black waters of the Channel, chasing the faint glow of lanterns and hope. They carried no medals, no headlines, and no promises, only the silent weight of missions that would never be spoken about. They were the invisible link between two worlds, the occupied and the free. And in the coming months, their courage would become one of the quiet pillars upon which the entire liberation of Europe would stand. They were not the heroes the public would remember, but without them, there might have been no liberation at all. The night began like so many before it, cold, damp, and silent. The wind that rolled across the flat fields of Northamptonshire carried the faint smell of oil and wet grass. Inside the operations hut at RAF Harrington, a group of men stood around a table marked with a map of France. Thin strings traced routes across the Channel, looping through the lowlands and down into the dark heart of occupied Europe. There were no words of ceremony, no speeches of valor, only the low hum of a generator, the clicking of a typewriter, and the quiet voice of the duty officer briefing the crew. Target zone, near Le Mans. Resistance code name, Falcon's Nest. Drop time, 1:12 hours. Expected weather, fog patches, light wind. German activity, moderate. The men nodded in silence. Captain Robert Andrews, now a veteran of more than 20 missions, studied the red circle penciled onto the map. It was barely an inch wide, but he knew it represented a patch of farmland that could mean life or death for a group of people waiting on the ground. Across from him, his navigator, Lieutenant Sam Hayes, leaned over the table, memorizing every bend in the Loire River. The rest of the crew prepared in quiet efficiency. No one asked questions. In the world of the carpetbaggers, knowledge was a burden that could get you killed. At 22:40 hours, their B-24, one of the black-painted Liberators, rolled out of the hangar. The aircraft bore no insignia, only the dull shine of its freshly oiled fuselage. The ground crew had already loaded the containers, 6 cylindrical canisters filled with rifles, ammunition, and radio equipment, and 2 small human packages, agents of the French resistance, dressed as civilians. They sat quietly near the rear hatch, faces pale under the red cabin lights. Andrews climbed into the cockpit and ran his gloved fingers over the switches and gauges. Everything had to be perfect. Once they crossed the Channel, there would be no help if something went wrong. Engines 1 through 4. Start sequence, he said softly. The Liberator came alive with a low, mechanical growl that shook the damp night air. By 23:05, the aircraft was rolling down the runway. The heavy bomber accelerated through the mist, its wheels lifting off the ground just before the runway lights disappeared behind it. The black plane climbed slowly, swallowed by the clouds. Below them, the English countryside dissolved into a sea of darkness. Ahead lay only the Channel, and beyond it, enemy territory. Inside the cockpit, the red glow of the instruments bathed the men's faces in ghostly light. The intercom crackled faintly. Crossing coast in 5 minutes, Hayes reported. Andrews nodded, his eyes fixed on the artificial horizon. Lights off. Radio silence. The crew obeyed instantly. The cabin went black except for the dim flicker of a compass needle. Once they left the safety of England, the air seemed to change. The horizon vanished. There were no stars, only a heavy mist that turned the world into shades of gray. The engines droned in perfect rhythm, the sound filling the fuselage like the beating of a giant heart. Every man aboard knew that one stray searchlight, one lucky shot of flak, could tear them out of the sky. As they crossed into occupied France, the navigator hunched over his map, tracing landmarks invisible to anyone else. He relied on the faint reflection of rivers, the faint pattern of towns whose lights had long been extinguished under blackout laws. Approaching target zone, he whispered, ETA 7 minutes. In the back of the aircraft, the 2 French agents prepared for their drop. One of them, a man in his mid-30s with sharp eyes, checked his parachute straps with trembling hands. His name was Marcel Delettre, though to the crew he was simply Falcon 2. He had been a schoolteacher before the war. Now he was returning home as a saboteur, carrying a radio transmitter and a list of railway schedules that would guide Allied bombers in the coming invasion. The dispatcher, Sergeant Miller, tapped him on the shoulder and gave a reassuring nod. "You'll be fine," he said quietly, though both men knew the truth. Most agents never came back. The red light near the hatch turned amber. The crew took their positions. The pilot reduced speed, bringing the massive bomber down to 700 feet. The smell of engine oil mixed with the sharp scent of cold air flooding through the open hatch. Below them stretched a black void, occasionally broken by the faint glimmer of a river. "Look sharp," the navigator said. "We're on course." Andrews peered through the cockpit window, searching for the signal. Somewhere down there, in a sea of darkness, resistance fighters were waiting. If they didn't show their lights in the next 60 seconds, the mission would be aborted. Then 3 quick flashes. Pause. 1 long flash. The pattern was unmistakable. "There they are," Andrews said. "Falcon's Nest confirmed." The green light came on. "Go!" Miller shouted. Delettre stepped into the wind and disappeared into the night, followed by his comrade. Seconds later, the first container rolled down the chute, then another and another, each one vanishing into the blackness below. The pilot held the Liberator steady while the dispatchers worked quickly, shouting over the roar of the engines. Within 90 seconds, the entire load was gone. "Cargo clear," Miller reported. "All 6 away." Andrews eased the throttle forward. "Let's get the hell out of here." The bomber climbed sharply, its engines straining as it turned northward. Below, the French countryside fell away. The crew watched in silence as distant tracers began to rise through the clouds, German anti-aircraft batteries firing blindly into the sky. None came close. The Liberator vanished back into the mist. For the next hour, they flew in radio silence, navigating only by compass and dead reckoning. Fatigue set in like a slow ache. The flight engineer rubbed his eyes, watching the fuel gauges drop inch by inch. There was something timeless about those missions, as if the aircraft existed in a world outside of dawn or day. The men didn't talk. They just listened to the engines, to the wind, to the faint pulse of fear in their own chests. When the coastline finally appeared on the radar screen, a collective breath escaped the crew. England. Home. The relief was quiet but profound. No cheering, no laughter, just a shared nod between men who had once again cheated death. At 3:42, the Duchess touched down at Harrington. The landing lights were dim, barely illuminating the slick runway. Ground crew ran to meet them, but no one asked questions. There were no reporters, no commanders waiting with congratulations. Only a clerk who handed Andrews a clipboard and said, "Write your report, Captain." He took the pencil, stared at the blank page, and wrote 6 words. "Mission complete. Cargo delivered. No casualties." Then he signed his name and walked away into the fog. Hours later, as dawn broke over France, a small group of resistance fighters recovered the containers from a field near Le Mans. By midday, the weapons were hidden in barns, and the agents who had dropped from the sky were already moving toward the city. Within a week, rail lines leading to Normandy would be destroyed in coordinated sabotage attacks. Back in England, Andrews and his crew prepared for another night's flight. There would be no rest, no glory, and no recognition. Only the endless darkness waiting beyond the channel. For the men of Operation Carpetbagger, every night was a new descent into the unknown. They flew not for fame or victory, but for the faint hope that somewhere in the shadows, freedom was stirring. And though the world would never know their names, history would one day remember what they had done. They were the ghosts of the night sky, silent, unseen, and absolutely vital to the coming liberation of Europe. They were not born heroes. They were clerks, teachers, farmers, mechanics, and dreamers. Ordinary men drawn into an extraordinary mission. Operation Carpetbagger was not only a triumph of technology and daring, but of humanity. Behind every black-painted Liberator that disappeared into the night sky stood a network of people who lived in the margins of secrecy, balancing duty with silence. At the center were the air crews, Americans mostly, though a few Canadians and Brits joined their ranks. They were young, many in their early 20s, but war had aged them beyond their years. Captain Robert Andrews and his crew were just one of dozens based at Harrington. By day, they might have seemed like any other airmen, smoking, playing cards, laughing too loudly to disguise their nerves. But when the sun went down, their faces hardened. They knew that what they carried was more valuable than bombs. It was trust. The training for these missions demanded not only skill, but emotional resilience. The men had to unlearn everything they'd been taught as bomber pilots. Precision bombing was about speed, altitude, and coordination. Carpetbagger flying required patience, intuition, and the courage to face silence. There were no formation leaders, no radio commands, and no visual cues, only the hum of the engines and the voice of a navigator whispering course corrections through the static. Andrews' crew had developed an unspoken rhythm. The pilot and co-pilot communicated in half sentences. The navigator murmured bearings, as if reciting a prayer, and the dispatchers in the back worked by feel, sensing the aircraft's tilt through muscle memory. Every man had a role, but their true strength lay in trust. They had to believe in one another completely and without hesitation. But the air crews were only one half of the equation. The other half operated on the ground. Agents, handlers, couriers, and resistance fighters whose lives depended on the accuracy of those nightly drops. Many of them were women. The Special Operations Executive had long recognized that women could move more freely through occupied territories, their courage often hidden behind calm faces. Among them were legends like Violette Sabo, Noor Inayat Khan, and Odette Sansom, names that would only emerge from the shadows years later. Noor Khan, a wireless operator of Indian descent, was one of the first to be sent into France under the Carpetbagger network. Her radio transmissions coordinated dozens of supply drops, each one a thread in the vast web of resistance. She knew the risk. Every time she pressed her key, German direction finders could triangulate her position. She moved constantly, carrying her transmitter in a heavy suitcase, always one step ahead of the Gestapo. For months, her signals guided the very Liberators that flew from Harrington. She was eventually captured and executed in Dachau. Her final word, according to witnesses, was Liberté. Then there were the French on the ground, the farmers who turned their fields into landing beacons, the priests who had agents in their churches, the children who carried coded notes sewn into their clothes. They were the invisible army that made every flight worthwhile. In one village near Tours, a woman named Jean Delaunay kept a lantern burning in her attic on the nights when drops were scheduled. To the Germans, she was a widow mourning her husband. To the resistance, she was a signal, a promise that the path was clear. Within the airbase itself, secrecy governed everything. The men of the 801st were told almost nothing about their cargo or their passengers. They didn't know who they were dropping, where exactly they were going, or what they would do when they landed. The fewer details known, the fewer could be betrayed. Orders came sealed. Maps were shredded after use. Even among themselves, they avoided talk of missions. A single careless word in a pub could undo months of preparation and cost dozens of lives. The ground crews shared in this quiet burden. They worked through the night, refueling, loading, and modifying aircraft with almost ritualistic precision. Each Liberator that rolled out of the hangar carried the fingerprints of men who would never leave England, yet whose contribution was etched into every successful flight. They called the aircraft "our girls," and many spoke to them before takeoff, as if the planes themselves were aware of their role in history. The leadership of the operation, men like Colonel Clifford Heflin and General Doolittle, understood that the Carpetbaggers occupied a unique moral space. Their missions blurred the line between military and espionage, between soldier and spy. If captured, the crews could not claim the protections of the Geneva Convention. Their uniforms were unmarked, their orders unofficial. For the men who flew, It was a quiet understanding that each takeoff could be their last, and that their country might never admit they'd existed. And yet, there was a strange freedom in that anonymity. Without the expectation of glory or recognition, they found purpose in the work itself. The letters recovered from airmen who didn't return often carried the same sentiment. We do this because it must be done. The British liaison officers at Harrington, many of them from the SOE, serve as the human link between the shadow world of resistance and the structured machinery of the U.S. Air Force. They were reserved, analytical, often haunted. Most had lost friends in occupied France. They carried themselves with a weary dignity, and when they briefed crews, their tone was neither inspiring nor dramatic. It was factual, precise, and heavy with unspoken weight. There was, too, a bond that transcended nationality. American crews came to respect their British counterparts deeply. The British admired the Americans' optimism, their unshakable confidence even in the face of impossible odds. In turn, the Americans learned from the British the art of restraint, the discipline to say nothing, to wait, to vanish before the dawn. One night, after a particularly rough mission that left bullet holes across the fuselage, Andrews's crew sat in the mess hall, drinking coffee gone cold. No one spoke for a long while. Finally, Sergeant Miller broke the silence. "You ever think," he said, staring into his cup, "that somewhere down there's a kid who'll live because of what we dropped tonight?" Andrews nodded. "That's the only thing worth thinking about." Outside, the night stretched endlessly over the English countryside. Another Liberator's engines began to rumble in the distance, its black shape gliding into the mist. Somewhere in France, someone was waiting. The men of Operation Carpetbagger did not see themselves as heroes. They were cogs in a hidden machine, anonymous hands turning the tide of silent war. But through their combined courage, the pilots in the sky, the agents in the fields, the villagers in the shadows, they built a bridge between hope and liberation. And as Europe slept under the iron weight of occupation, these men and women, unseen, unheard, and uncelebrated, kept the flame of freedom alive, one flight at a time. Every mission began in silence. There were no fanfares, no speeches, no flag-waving ceremonies. Just a cold wind sweeping across the tarmac at Harrington Airfield and the low, throaty rumble of engines warming in the dark. It was usually close to midnight when the call came. The crew would be summoned quietly, their names checked off a clipboard by an officer who avoided eye contact. They didn't ask where they were going. They already knew it would be somewhere across the channel, deep into a darkness that swallowed both fear and reason. Each aircraft was prepared like a priest readying for ritual. The black paint absorbed the searchlights. The fuel tanks brimmed to the edge. Inside the fuselage, every crate was secured and labeled with a number that meant nothing to anyone except a handful of men in a locked office miles away. Weapons, explosives, radios, codebooks, food, and the occasional human passenger. Each item part of a vast chess game played across occupied Europe. The crew climbed aboard one by one. Captain Andrews would pat the fuselage twice before entering, a small superstition that spread among the other pilots. In the narrow confines of the cockpit, the dim glow of the instruments painted their faces in shades of red and green. The navigator spread out his maps, marked with tiny circles where friendly lights would flash below. The dispatcher checked his cargo once more, whispering to himself, "We don't drop boxes. We drop hope." Takeoff was always the same. The heavy Liberator accelerating across the runway until it seemed the weight of its secrecy might drag it back to Earth. Then, almost reluctantly, it lifted into the air. Within minutes, the English coast disappeared behind them. Ahead stretched a void, black ocean, black sky, black horizon. Somewhere in that vast emptiness, German radar and night fighters waited. Crossing the channel was a test of nerve. The crews flew low, often below 500 feet, skimming the waves to avoid radar detection. In the cockpit, every man felt the same pulse of tension. One flicker of light, one reflection on the water, and the night fighters would descend like hawks. Sometimes, The radio operator would catch faint bursts of German transmissions. They never spoke of them. As they reached the French coast, the mission entered its most dangerous phase. The landscape below was a patchwork of darkness. Villages under curfew, forests hiding resistance groups, fields marked with a faint glow of coded signals. Each drop zone used a unique light pattern. 3 short flashes, 1 long, or a specific bonfire formation. Sometimes, the pattern would be wrong, and the crew had to decide within seconds whether it was an enemy trap or a resistance mistake. Captain Andrews remembered one night vividly. The signal below was faint, the pattern uncertain. His instincts told him to abort, but the navigator, squinting through the darkness, insisted it matched the coordinates. Andrews made the call. "We go in." The Liberator descended to 600 feet. The dispatcher crouched at the open hatch, the cold air tearing through the fuselage. Below, the silhouettes of men waved small lamps in rhythm. At the signal, the dispatcher began pushing crates into the night, their parachutes blooming like pale ghosts. Each crate landed softly, swallowed by the darkness. Then came the final drop, a passenger. The man wore a black jumpsuit, his face pale and unreadable. He nodded once at the dispatcher, stepped into the slipstream, and vanished. No words, no goodbyes, only the wind. The Liberator climbed, banking hard to the west. Within seconds, the lights below disappeared. The crew exhaled, each man aware that what they had just done might shift the balance of the underground war by a fraction of a fraction. In that moment, even the smallest success felt monumental. Not every mission ended so cleanly. Sometimes the signals were never seen, or the weather turned violent. More than once, the crew found themselves lost in fog so thick they could barely read their instruments. There were nights when they returned with their cargo still intact, silent and frustrated. And there were other nights, worse ones, when the aircraft never came back at all. One crew, led by Lieutenant James Mac McAllister, disappeared over Normandy in early 1944. Their last radio message was a calm, clipped approaching drop zone. The wreckage was never found. For weeks, their names were whispered around the base with a kind of reverent grief. Then their lockers were cleared, their bunks reassigned, and the war went on. The silence of loss was just another part of the job. But when the mission succeeded, the results rippled far beyond what the air crews could imagine. Every crate dropped in a moonlit field armed a cell of the French resistance. Every agent delivered behind enemy lines became a voice for sabotage, intelligence, or uprising. Rail lines were blown, communication cables cut, German convoys ambushed. And as D-Day approached, the chaos sown by those operations would save countless Allied lives. The dispatchers never saw the faces of the people who recovered their cargo. But sometimes, months later, a small note or token would find its way back to the airfield. A piece of parachute silk with Merci scrawled in pencil. A photo of a group of partisans holding the very crates dropped from a Harrington Liberator. Those small messages meant everything. Proof that the invisible war was being won one night at a time. By 1944, the operation had become a finely tuned machine. Dozens of sorties launched each night, each one following a silent choreography of trust and risk. Yet, despite its growing precision, the tension never faded. Each mission was still a step into uncertainty, a test of skill, courage, and restraint. The British press never reported on the Carpetbaggers. Their names never appeared in the news. The men of the 800 first operated in a world where success was measured not in medals, but in the absence of failure. If the drop was made and the crew returned alive, it was victory enough. As dawn crept over England, the Liberators returned one by one. The airfield came alive with the sound of tires screeching against wet tarmac. Ground crews rushed forward, counting each plane like a mother counting her children after a storm. Inside the cockpits, the airmen were pale, exhausted, eyes red from hours of concentration. They would debrief quietly, eat, sleep a few hours, and prepare to do it all again the next night. And when darkness fell once more over occupied Europe, another group would climb into another black-painted aircraft, carrying another fragment of hope. The rhythm of their courage never faltered. They were ghosts over France, seen only by those who waited in secret fields, their engines humming like whispers of freedom. Each night flight was a promise kept, each drop a defiance of tyranny. In a vast ledger of war, their contribution was written not in headlines or parades, but in the quiet liberation of a continent. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Europe were changing. What had once been the territory of night fighters and flak bursts was now dominated by Allied air power. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, its fuel reserves dwindling, its best pilots gone. The thunder of bombers over Germany was no longer an act of daring. It was inevitability. Yet in the quiet hangars of Harrington, the black-painted Liberators still waited. Their missions hadn't ended with the turning tide. Operation Carpetbagger continued, though its purpose was evolving. The night drops no longer fed a starving resistance in secrecy. They now prepared it for open revolt. As Allied armies advanced through France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, the same networks that had once hidden radios and agents now coordinated uprisings and sabotage in support of the liberation. The shadow war that had once been silent was beginning to echo in the daylight. For Captain Andrews and his crew, the final months of the war carried a strange tension. Victory was near, yet the danger had not lessened. Their missions took them deeper into territory that was collapsing in chaos. Some German units fought to the last. Others simply melted away. In that confusion, the resistance found its greatest moment and its greatest peril. Every flight could still end in disaster. One night in February 1945, Andrews flew a mission over the Netherlands. The weather was brutal, sleet hammering against the canopy, visibility almost zero. Their drop zone was near Eindhoven, where resistance forces were sabotaging retreating German convoys. The signal lights were barely visible through the storm, but Andrews held steady. The dispatcher shouted over the wind, releasing the final crate into the night. Moments later, tracers lanced up from the darkness below. The Germans had seen them. Andrews pushed the throttles forward, engines screaming as the Liberator clawed for altitude. A bullet tore through the fuselage, narrowly missing the radio operator. For a full 10 minutes, they flew blind, every man certain it was their last mission. When they finally crossed the coast, the entire crew was silent. No one spoke until the wheels touched English soil. They had survived again. A few weeks later, orders came down. The Carpetbagger missions were being reduced. Liberation had overtaken them. The resistance no longer needed supply drops. They needed coordination, communication, integration with advancing Allied armies. For the first time in years, the Black Liberators sat idle. The men wandered the base, restless, unsure of what to do with the quiet. In the mess hall, Andrews found a message pinned to the bulletin board. It was from a French resistance liaison in London. A single sentence, written in clean handwriting. To the men of the 801st, without your courage, our hope would have starved in the dark. France remembers. There was no ceremony, no official disbanding parade. The war still raged elsewhere, and the Carpetbaggers simply faded from the schedule, absorbed back into regular bomber groups, or sent home. Their aircraft were repainted, their serial numbers reassigned. To the outside world, the operation had never existed. Yet, in the villages and forests of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, people remembered. Long after the guns fell silent, farmers still found fragments of parachute silk in their fields, ammunition boxes buried beneath the soil, and rusted canisters marked F-801st. To them, those black aircraft had been angels, appearing without warning, bringing weapons, food, and faith when all seemed lost. In post-war debriefings, British intelligence officers attempted to quantify the success of the operation. They calculated tonnage dropped, number of agents delivered, enemy convoys disrupted. But the true measure of Operation Carpetbagger could never be written in statistics. Its victory was measured in whispers, the secret messages passed between agents, the sparks of rebellion that turned into flames of freedom. Many of the men who flew those missions never spoke of them again. They returned home, built lives, raised families. When asked about their service, they might mention supply work or special duty flights. Only decades later, when the operation was finally declassified, did their children learn what those quiet flights had really meant. In 1993, a memorial was erected near Harrington Airfield. It stands on the very ground where the Black Liberators once waited for the signal to launch. The inscription is simple. To the men of the 801st/492nd Bomb Group, Carpetbaggers, who flew by night to bring freedom by day. Visitors still come. Some are historians, others descendants of those who lived through the occupation. Many leave small tokens, a piece of parachute cloth, a model aircraft, a note written in French, English, or Dutch. The most common message is always the same: merci. Looking back, historians often call Operation Carpetbagger one of the most effective covert missions of World War II. It bridged the gap between espionage and air power, proving that the quietest operations could yield the loudest victories. It showed that wars are not won by firepower alone, but by faith, the faith that unseen allies are working in the dark to keep hope alive. In the end, the men of the Carpetbaggers were never meant to be remembered as heroes in the traditional sense. They had no medals pinned in grand ceremonies, no triumphal photographs. Their legacy lived instead in the liberation they helped deliver and in the silent gratitude of those who survived because of their courage. As the sun sets over the English countryside, the fields around Harrington are quiet again. The runways have long since cracked and faded, the control towers reduced to ruins. Yet if you stand there on a still night, some say you can almost hear the low hum of engines on the wind, a ghostly echo of the Black Liberators climbing into the darkness, carrying their fragile cargo of hope. They flew without recognition, fought without headlines, and returned without applause. But in the balance of history, their silence was thunder. Their mission, hidden, dangerous, and selfless, was not just a story of war. It was a story of humanity's most enduring weapon, the belief that even in the darkest night, someone will still risk everything to deliver the light.